Tendayi Marovah, Dr. Tendayi Marovah works as a lecturer at Midlands State University. And Tendayi and I met, I think we first met, but we don't remember, that when I was working at the University of in South Africa, like 4 or 5 years ago. And currently, we're collaborating on 2 HRC GCF grants. That looks into street art, and then the other one looks into decolonizing and gender peace education. Tendayi mostly works on capability approach as a normative, analytical, and evaluative tool to assess the contribution of education in Zimbabwe towards human development and social justice. And he also works on history education and citizenship education. And today he'll be presenting us one of his postdoctoral research that focuses on history education in Zimbabwe. And that presentation will take around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking some questions. Yeah, Grant is yours, Doctor.
Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. Right. Before I get into the presentation itself, I want to make it clear that this is still work in progress. And I started developing these ideas when I was at Midlands State University. I joined Midlands State University about a year and a half ago in February 2018. So the title of my presentation is using historical consciousness to conceptualize critical pedagogy in secondary school history teaching in the context of Zimbabwe. Being a history educator with teacher education, I became interested in issues to do with pedagogical issues, particularly critical pedagogy. But I'm not going to be talking about the normative critical pedagogy as advanced by Paulo Freire. I'm going to shift a bit and focus on the philosophy of history and how it informs critical pedagogy. So to that effect, my presentation outline will be based on the following subtopics. I will first of all present the background of the paper and also my positionality. I understand that I was given 5 minutes to talk about myself. I'll try to situate myself in the context of the presentation, also the works that I do. I will briefly talk about the contribution which I think this paper is going to actually make in the process of contributing either towards literature or practice. I also highlight my major argument in the particular paper. Then I would dwell on history philosophy and how it informs that now the pedagogy in the history classroom. I will look at a few conceptual issues in order for me to clearly explain and position myself within the debates of history teaching and learning. Then I will switch my focus on what is happening or what is being advanced in a curriculum that has been introduced some 2 years ago in Zimbabwe, which they call the competence-based curriculum. By implication, they are shifting from a knowledge-based curriculum to a curriculum that focuses more on competencies. So I will also talk about the philosophy of Ubuntu, because it is this philosophy which grounds the whole curriculum. They have decided that in order for us to teach what we have to teach, which is meaningful to our context, then we should be informed by a philosophy which is homegrown, and to them Ubuntu is such a philosophy. I'll talk a little bit about why the philosophy is important and how it can then be used to inform pedagogy within the context of history education. I will then dwell on a few practical suggestions for classroom practice informed by my conceptualization and also my understanding of historical consciousness as a key to the teaching and learning of history. So on that note, let me start by providing a brief background to and also my personality to the teaching and learning of history. I don't consider myself a historian. There is always a mistake, especially in the context where I come from, that history teachers, history educators want to call themselves historians. To me, historians are concerned with the business of reconstructing the past. I am not concerned with that business. I am concerned with the business of teaching history, teaching what has been reconstructed. And therefore, that's why I am thinking and reflecting more precisely on how I teach what I teach. So it's not my business to be reconstructing the past. So I'm a history secondary school teacher by training, and also I've taught citizenship education, but right now I am a teacher educator, particularly in history education. So I draw my experience from my own practice as a history educator, and also my practice as a citizenship educator, and also as a teacher educator. In the process, I taught mostly in rural areas, in disadvantaged contexts, which gave me, quite a challenge, because in most cases, these schools in rural areas, for those who know Zimbabwe, I'm glad that there's someone who has been to Zimbabwe here. They are the least resources, schools, and the nature of the learning there is quite deplorable, in the sense that even the teachers who are there, mostly they are the least, trained teachers. The resources are also very limited. So from that background, I want us to know that I started thinking critically about how then one can teach in a more critical manner in a context that is so disadvantaged like the context of Zimbabwe. I therefore started experimenting with various teaching methods as a reflective practice, where I would think about the methods which I was taught at college, and methods which I would have researched on, and also how I was teaching what I was teaching. Most of the methods, of course, they are given in an umbrella way, so as in a general way, so to say. But then you need then to think of how applicable those particular methods are in your own context, and that reflection is the one that is informing this particular paper that I'm going to be presenting. So what is the contribution of the paper? One may want to know. This paper contributes to debates on pedagogical practices, secondary school history in particular. And I also think that in the context where the Zimbabwean curriculum has shifted from a knowledge-based curriculum to a competence-based curriculum, the paper is going to also contribute to debates on how we then have to teach what we teach. All along, obviously, in a knowledge-based curriculum, usually traditional methods of teaching are the ones that take the center stage. But now that we've decided to shift from a knowledge-based curriculum to a competence-based curriculum, we should think carefully about how our teaching then should also shift from a teaching that emphasizes on knowledge to a teaching that emphasizes now on developing certain competencies. Surprisingly, there's not been much debate on how the shifting from a knowledge-based curriculum to a competence-based curriculum can be achieved, despite, of course, the general agreement that the teaching should be learner-centered. But the question how we are going to operationalize that, there's not been much talked about and debated on. There is actually very limited literature, especially in Zimbabwe, regarding to the teaching and learning of history in general. So, on that note, I am advancing an argument that historical consciousness is the highest level of engagement in a history classroom. I will try to explain what I mean by historical consciousness as we progress with the discussion. Of course, by making such an assertion, I am conscious of the fact that I am taking a risk. That others would say, what makes you think that historical consciousness is the highest level of engagement in any history classroom, and particularly so in the context of Zimbabwe? But that is my argument, and I'm going to support and provide evidence why I think that it makes sense more than any other form of teaching. I have preferred this level ahead of other levels of teaching or of interacting in a history classroom, such as the one that is called historical literacy and historical awareness, because historical consciousness is deeply aligned to a historical mode of inquiry, which advances historical thinking and also historical reasoning, where history is defined as a contentious subject, and as such, because of the controversies associated with history, in order for us to engage learners in a critical manner, we must operate above historical literacy and also above historical awareness. So what informs my thoughts about this particular way of learning and this particular way of teaching? I'm informed by history philosophy, which I'm going to just briefly talk about as defined by various philosophers and also scholars. History philosophy, if you look at the writings of Hegel, he says philosophy of history means nothing but the thoughtful consideration of it. So philosophy of history, or history philosophy, as I perceive those, it's one and the same thing. But Hegel emphasizes on the idea that we should not be troubled by, trying to conceptualize and philosophize and theorize about what it is. Because whenever you start engaging or thinking carefully about what you consider history to be, you are now starting to operate within the realm of the philosophy of history or history philosophy. And when we do that, we start invoking notions of the idea of agency in history. How much agency do people have as they then develop certain histories? Because we also believe that history is made by people, by what we do and how we do what we do. So how much agency do we have? We also, when we also engage with the issues to do with changes and continuities, when we engage with the role of material circumstances in human affairs, and when we also look at the putative meaning of historical events, we'll be now dwelling upon the realm of history philosophy. On that note, we also realize that when we deal with the philosophies of history, we are raising the possibility of learning from history itself. Otherwise, if we don't start questioning what goes around within the processes of history making, we don't learn anything from history. But in order for us to learn from history, then we must philosophize. We must start asking difficult questions about what happens in history, about changes, about continuities, and about the role of what surrounds humanity, which shapes the course of history. The philosophy of history also goes on the possibility of better understanding ourselves in the context of the present by understanding various forces, choices, and circumstances that brought us to our current situation. So this way of looking at history is quite philosophical in nature, in that it doesn't look at history in a simplistic and straight line manner. It tries to reflect it back and forth, tries to analyze circumstances, try to ask questions which are not asked by ordinary citizens when they look at historical narratives. So this, to me, is what history philosophy is about. And when you start now undertaking history philosophy, you'll be left without any option but to keep on asking yourself questions which you may not be able to answer. And in many contexts, historians are understood as people who don't take things at face value. It is because mostly they will be informed by such nature of philosophies within their subject area. I also want to look at various developments within the realm of history philosophy, because we don't have just one domain of history philosophy. There are several aspects, there are several domains within the philosophy of history. The very first domain, although these domains are informed, of course, by mainstream philosophy in history, but they are these main domains tend to speak to certain ways of doing history and how we understand history, and therefore this is what I'm going to be dwelling on. The first form of philosophy in history is that one that is speculative. The speculative domain of philosophy in history is theological in its approach from the conventional term theology, where the truths are absolute, because they believe that the truth is divine and therefore it should not be questioned. And where historians or history teachers are informed by such a philosophy, you find the type of teaching that they do is one that will be sort of teacher-centered, where the teacher knows it all because he is the ultimate voice of the divine being who would have shaped the history of the people. But I'm not informed by this type of philosophy in history. I refuse to be informed by this. There is yet another one, which is sort of inquiry-like. This started developing in the age of enlightenment, where it was questioning the assertion that the truths are absolute. You and I know quite well that for a long time the world has been made to believe that the earth is moving around. Or was it the sun moving around? Which is moving around?
The earth is moving around.
Oh, I'm glad that you now know it. It has not been like that before. Before, it was actually
believe that the earth was flat.
No, the earth was flat and we were in the center and
okay. The thing is, that position was questioned. And there are people who died and were regarded as teaching heresy during that particular period of time. So the philosophy of history now, informed by the age of enlightenment, started questioning certain historical positions which were regarded as absolute, which were regarded as truthful historical narratives which were not supposed to be questioned. They started doing that. You can refer to historical philosophers like Vico and Hedda. They are quite popular in that period of time. Then there also came an age of understanding history as a process of dialectical change during the age of philosophers like Hegel and also Marx, where the historians started understanding history as an ongoing process of engagement, where one position can tomorrow be upset and questioned and dislodged by another, but the other which would have come into place can also be questioned, and it becomes a continual process. This is whereby they would say a thesis always has an antithesis, which can be questioned through a process of synthesizing the antithesis, and we come up with a new thesis, and the process is continual like that. So with that in mind, therefore, the type of history that will be taught there is a history that is open to dialogue, a history that can be questioned, a new position accepted, but those positions will never be final positions. I know that there are others who believe that knowledge shouldn't be like that. Knowledge should be factual, it should be absolute. But over time, we have learned that knowledge is ever changing. What we used to know, or what we used to call reality, is a few years ago is no longer reality these years that we are living in now. So with that in mind, let me go on to what I can call later systems or post-modernist ways of looking at things, where truths are multiple. And as such, we look upon history as a multiple form of narratives that are informed by the evidence that would have stumbled upon. Because if you stumble upon a certain type of evidence in history, that then informs the way you view your worldview in terms of history. And someone may stumble upon a different type of evidence. And as such, historical narratives then should be made to engage with each other, and they are informed by multi perspectives, which means we have to bring what we have on the table and start engaging with each other. But my question is, in order for us to develop these ways of thinking of engagement, which type of pedagogy best fits this? Now, I'm going to try and go a step further so as to look at 3 levels of engagement in pedagogical issues in history. Level number 1 is historical literacy, number 2, historical awareness, and number 3, historical consciousness. I'm now going back to those ideas I had introduced that I said I'll come back to them. So let's start with historical literacy. What is it that we call historical literacy? First of all, it is informed by behaviorism, up to such an extent that we can call it a behavioristic term, where there is a demand for master of basic historical information, which should enable learners to participate in historical readings and also in discussions. But there is something that I want us to notice from the word go, that this type of historical learning or teaching does not require a person to attribute meaning to history. It only enables this particular learner to be able to read historical issues without necessarily being personally involved, without personally engaging. As the word is suggesting literacy, the learner will end up being just a literate historical learner. And how is it different now from historical awareness? Here is the sharp difference. Whereas historical literacy, it's also important, by the way, whereas historical literacy enables someone to read without really attaching any personal meaning to some historical events, historical awareness tries to develop an ability to link specific pieces of historical information to some well-known basic events and phenomena. There is now a little bit of engagement. What you have read with some, historical phenomena. And this person who is operating at a historical awareness is actually conscious of the fact that history is a controversial subject. Different historical scholars have different opinions over different events and how to interpret them. But the learner himself or herself is not critically involved in the processes through which these particular teachers or scholars would have undergone. So you'll hear such kind of a historical learner quoting various opinions by various learners. According to Finista 2020, the first Chimurenga was caused by local, factors. However, Corbyn disagrees with that. He thinks, but without putting on his own voice or judgment. Let me not preempt what is coming. It is a pragmatic requirement in history, also useful, but it does not entail being personally bothered about history when you are operating at this particular level. And I went on to suggest that if one cannot do this historical awareness, if one cannot be bothered about one's history, the implication is an inability to make sense of the past when encountering its stresses or preservations. When you are not engaging, personally involved in historical narratives and historical events, you will not be able to make sense of the past. You will not be able to apply what happened in the past today, or even to try and extrapolate it in the other future context. So it also has its own weakness. I want you to take note of the fact that in as much as it has its own weakness, it has its own place as well in the process of teaching and learning history. But let me quickly come to historical consciousness. Before I look at historical consciousness, I decided that I dwell on the word consciousness. And in analyzing the word consciousness, I think it will be very easy for me then to come up to agree with certain scholars or to disagree with them in the way they understand historical consciousness. First and foremost, I don't want us to think about consciousness using the psychological definition of consciousness, which we all know. That in psychology, when somebody is said to be conscious, he is said to be aware of what is happening around him. So as for us to differentiate historical awareness and consciousness, let us leave that definitions. It is not exciting to us today. Biko in 1973, who was an Africanist, say that when we talk about the consciousness, we are talking about, he was actually referring to black consciousness. And I want to apply his understanding to our worldview of teaching and learning of history. He talks about the realization of the need to rally together around the cause of our oppression. And in this particular case, in as much as he was talking about political, social, and economic oppression, I want to talk about an epistemic form of oppression, where ways of knowing and how we know are determined by the one who is standing before you. And he says, in order for us to be conscious, to reach the level of consciousness, we must first of all realize that there is a need for us to be together around fighting or dislodging the ways of knowing that surrounds us. Maybe you can draw on the arguments also posed by Freire, where he says, where the learners are oppressed, we need a pedagogy of the oppressed, where the teacher shouldn't be the banker who is banking knowledge in some empty vessels we commonly call tabula rasas. No. The teacher should be conscious of the fact that learners also have a lot of knowledge and information which they have, which is useful for the teaching and learning of any particular subject. So we must come to a point where we realize that to emulate the other, I have decided to use the word mimic the other, to copy the other, copy pasting, is to insult the intelligence of whoever has created you. When Biko was talking about this, he was talking about mimicking those who were at the realm of power within the politics of South Africa, within the apartheid system. He was saying to try and imitate those was to insult the intelligence. And I want to say that this also applies in the teaching and learning of history. To try and mimic your own teacher, to try and mimic the one who is perceived to be having it all is actually a way of insulting your own intelligence. Otherwise, we don't grow if we resort to just mimicking what we hear from our teachers and learners. Said to say that unless teachers are conscious of this, what they teach will also be a mimicking the way they were taught by their own teachers. And you agree with me that if you are teaching within your subconscious, you tend to teach the way you were taught by your own teachers, particularly those who impressed you. But then, in order for us to be operating beyond the level of awareness and literacy, we must be conscious of the fact that we shouldn't be mimickers, but rather we should be our own selves. So there should be deliberateness of diversity in humanity. There should be deliberateness of diversity in our teaching and in our learning. The way we teach, we should be conscious of the fact that we should be different because we are different. Otherwise, if I tend to teach the way my teacher teaches me, what it means is I'm killing diversity. I'm killing my individuality in terms of how I articulate and understand things. So with that in mind, historical consciousness should be an interaction between making sense of the past and constructing expectations for the future. Otherwise, if we are not historically conscious, we will not be able to make the difference between the past, the present, and the future. Number two, historical consciousness is a rational and also intellectually honest way of using history. I know that people will question the idea of intellectual honestness, where particularly narratives are actually subjective depending on the type of historical evidence that you would have stumbled upon. But if we are honest in terms of understanding the evidence that we have and also in understanding the context of the narratives, then we should be able to be rational enough to inform our interpretation of history and historical narratives that will be surrounding us. And that note, we also come to an understanding that historical consciousness is not only a product of the school. It cannot be a product of the school alone. Historical consciousness it speaks to individual growth through a reflexive relation with society, that is within the school and outside the school itself. Up to such an extent that there is need then to question what the teacher teaches me. There is need for learners then to also question what they are taught at home, to also taught, particularly in higher education context, to also question the narratives that come from maybe certain political teachings in our context like Zimbabwe. You realize that there are a lot of narratives that come direct from politics coming into the classroom without being filtered, without being sieved, and that defeats the process of or historical consciousness. So if we are to be historically conscious, we'll be conscious of the fact that there is always a reflective process in our understanding of what we are doing and what is done outside the school context. Let me go on to give you a little bit of some quotations by political leaders who I think were becoming a little bit conscious of the idea of revisiting the way history was taught, particularly in the context of colonial Africa. That's Seretse Kama, 1970. It was at a graduation ceremony, when he said that we were taught sometimes in a very positive way to despise ourselves and our ways of life. It was during the colonial era. And that mentality, that mental colonization sort of, still persisted in post-colonial contexts, where the teacher will teach learners to just consume, regurgitate, and reproduce what he would have told them. By so doing, that particular teacher will be teaching learners to despise themselves, because he is not giving them, the ability to be conscious of their capacities or capabilities to do and to think in certain ways, particularly in questioning historical narratives. He goes on to say, we're meant to believe that we had no past to speak of, no history to boast of. Even, some very current historians like Robert, of course, in the 1970s, was well known of advancing such a theory that in Africa, they don't have a history. Their history only started when, the colonizers came in. They are the ones who started teaching them their history. And unless we are driven by historical consciousness, we may not be able to keep this. We'll continue regurgitating and parroting historical narratives which undermine our capacities to also contribute towards history. The end result of that way of teaching, which was being alluded to by Seretse Kama, was that their self-pride and their self-confidence were badly undermined, which is very obvious. Whenever that type of teaching is undertaken, there is what I've been taught, that it's called epistemic injustice will happen, where, self-confidence will be, and self-pride will be badly undermined. And for history, which is always used to, develop this sense of patriotism, it will be particularly dangerous to the notion of patriotism. Seretse Kama also then suggested that we should write our own history books to prove we did have a past, and that it was a past that was just as worth writing and learning about as any other. That's a good suggestion. But my question is, in what mode are we going to be writing those particular books? In what mode are we going to be teaching our own history? Because there is danger that we then tend to teach the new way of looking at history from the perspective of those who are in power. And once that happens, we'll not have moved an inch from, the type of history which we were taught in the colonial era. We must do this for the simple reason that a nation without a past is a lost nation, and a people without a past is a people without a soul. I agree with him there, but I still question. It depends on what informs the way you teach what you are teaching. So with that in mind, let me quickly go to the competence-based curriculum in Zimbabwe, which has been recently introduced. Some of the issues it seeks to advance, and skills, competences which it seeks to advance, include critical thinking, research, problem solving, conflict resolution, communication, decision making. Those are only part of those. I've decided to capture those because, to me, those are some of the competencies which are needed, especially in life, in order for us to contribute meaningfully towards national development or towards the development of humankind. Critical thinking is very essential, research, problem solving. But let me also remind you that when I look at these skills and go back to historical literacy, where a teacher provides notes for a learner, and the learner spends the whole night cramming and then prepares for the exam, and passes with a distinction. I don't think historical literacy, the ability to regurgitate historical narratives, would really develop critical thinking or problem-solving skills. In as much as we need to be literate, but in terms of problem solving, where a history learner should be able to relate what he knows to his own surroundings, we need to go a step further. But historical awareness, just being aware that there are a lot of varied, historical narratives, is also not enough. But critical thinking, I think, is actually generated where there is a consciousness of the fact that as an individual, we should also have a voice in the historical narratives which we are taught in our everyday lives. That's why then I have decided that in order for the competence-based curriculum in Zimbabwe to be effectively operationalized, then it's not about repackaging the content only, it's also about looking at the pedagogy. Where I have then said, given the philosophy of Ubuntu, which drives the curriculum itself, to what extent does this philosophy, which says, I am because you are, to what extent does it develop notions to do with critical thinking? To what extent does it promote deliberation? Because for critical thinking to happen, there should be deliberation. To what extent does it allow for accommodation? To what extent does it relate to issues to do with trustworthiness, respect? These are some of the values of the philosophy of Ubuntu. Our Ubuntu should be deeply embedded within the understanding of consciousness, of historical consciousness. Unless it does that, it becomes an empty philosophy with very good values, but which are not operationalized in everyday teaching. So how do we deal with this now? If we have a positive attitude in terms of who we are and how we perceive others, and if we have an understanding that it's none but ourselves who can change how we do what we do, then we'll be able to get somewhere. I'm also persuaded that if we are original, if we are ourselves, and we participate in a reflective practice, it is possible that we achieve historical consciousness and we enhance critical pedagogy. We should be problem solvers. We should be problem solvers. We should also be able to learn the art to communicate and deliberate with others. All these issues that I'm talking about here, I have adopted them from the values of the philosophy of Ubuntu. And to that effect, you would learn to respect others for who they are, and they will also learn to respect you for who you are. On that note, I want to thank you for listening very attentively to this particular presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tendayi. So we'll just take a couple of questions now, and if any of our online audience wants to send us questions, they can always email their questions to addressseminars@lancaster.ac.uk. So, any questions?
Can I?
Yeah, please.
First of all, thank you very much indeed. I'm not a history teacher. I'm not a historian. I was a primary school teacher originally, and I know one or two people who are history teachers. So I've been fascinated. I'd like to just go back to the slide that you had about your Ubuntu, because it's not something that I'm very familiar with.
Oh.
But what I was interested in was asking a little bit more about, in that context, what accommodation means. And my reason for asking about it is that within inclusion, which is a sort of way of thinking about teaching and learning within the UK context, we have a notion from a disability perspective of something called reasonable adjustment. But then the notion of accommodation also is sometimes used in some countries and some contexts. So I'd just like to know a little bit more about what accommodation means in Ubuntu, because I think it's one of the terms that is potentially used in different situations, and it's just interesting to what we all bring to it, really.
Okay, can I respond to that one?
Of course.
All right. What I want us to understand is that in order for us to interrogate these values quite well, let us take Ubuntu as a philosophy, which means what is written there about its values are deeply philosophical. These are deeply philosophical values, where accommodation is multidimensional, where accommodation is a social reality, it is also a political reality, it's an economic reality. What do I mean by that? It means the first thing is you recognize that your being a person is only enriched by you accommodating others in various contexts, appreciating others, accepting others as they are, whether in terms of our political thinking, whether in terms of our economic orientation by way of what do we do in order for us to achieve well-being. Unless we start accommodating others, doing what we do not for profit but for the public good. Unless we start understanding accommodation as such, in such a philosophical way, then we won't be able to meet the requirements of the philosophy of Ubuntu.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. It's really interesting. Your discussion around consciousness and essentially pre-colonial history in Zimbabwe or wherever, to what extent does that feature in the curriculum?
I'll put in there, I'm going back historically 30 years, but when I arrived in Zimbabwe, I taught history in the secondary school system. I was presented by the head teacher with textbooks that had no Zimbabwean history. It claimed, great, Zimbabwe was built by Egyptians. It was totally eradicated, and the only way I found to deal with that, given it was a curriculum I had to teach to, was say, this is what your textbooks say. Go away, talk to your family, get your oral history, see how you can add knowledge and colour and counter, perhaps, what it says in these textbooks. And it was an interesting way of doing it. One school I was at, the white head teacher did not approve, and I ended up moving schools. But it was very, very much still, in 1986, 1987, 1988, a very colonial curriculum that we were told to teach. And of course, being white European, I didn't have that knowledge. I'd go to my Mukwamba family and say, please, tell me your history. How does this read to you? So I would have some knowledge to take into the classroom. And then it would be talking to the students and say, how can you counter this? Because it is what it is that we've got to teach. But it was the only way to deal with it. So I hope that things have moved on vastly from that. And my very poor attempts at trying to do something more.
Sure, there has been critical debates about those, representations, or rather misrepresentations of our historical past. But also, in the post-colonial era, there are also some other historical notions which are presented almost like the way the colonial curriculum presented historical narratives. For example, the type of history that is taught right now is predominantly the history of the dominant ethnic groups, the Shonas and the Debeles. There is very limited space for these other minority ethnic groups, the Tonga, the Zendas, etc. There is limited space for that. even in the current political discourses, the historical narratives which are dominant in the curriculum are narratives about ZANU-PF, the ruling party, and some opposition parties over the years who are given very limited space. So that's that type of teaching history. I don't think it's progressive. It is a type of history that is not very different from the colonial type of history, which
it's just different masters' perspective.
Yeah, something like that.
So the next question would be, in terms of teacher training, how do you introduce consciousness to new ways of teaching, and also within essentially what is kind of an old curriculum, in a sense, or an old style curriculum?
All right. That's a very good, brilliant question, because this is something that I'm involved in. And at times I encounter my experiences with students was that they are so much used to these, traditional ways of teaching. So much that if you want them to get to these ways of teaching where you are trying to conscientize them so that they become historically conscious, most of them don't appreciate these methods which critically engages with them. But if you would do so, would soon appreciate the value of critical pedagogy and the historical consciousness. And they tend then to generate a lot of excitement in the classroom in terms of contributing to debates or debating amongst themselves, and you'll be there also as an active participant, observing how the debates are being carried out, and also contributing to the debates yourself, and allowing them also to challenge you. And this is how I've tried to do so in the teacher education enterprise. I have actually told them that I am training you to become a teacher. So I don't train you by giving you notes. I don't train you by, making sure that you have knowledge without the skills to engage in various circumstances and contexts. So I'm not sure whether this is widely practiced, but at the level, at least, which informs how I do what I do, this is what I currently do.
Could I follow on from that? Because I think I was interested as well about the competence-based curriculum and the extent of where had that come from within a Zimbabwean context, because it reminds me very much in a sense of some of the debates and discussions that we have within a HE context around what is often seen as employability. It's had a whole history of different names and terms. But in some ways, if one is going to have a curriculum that's competence-based, that's going to potentially, in terms of what you've been saying, it feels as if that's going to be supportive of getting people to question, getting people to engage, getting people to see that there is a problem. And so where did the competence-based curriculum come from? And do you think that it is going to help you in terms of achieving some of the teacher education approaches you're attempting to sort of try and develop?
The competence-based curriculum is a product of several processes, but the most prominent process was that one which was undertaken in 1999 through what was called a Commission of Inquiry into Education and Training, where stakeholders criticized the curriculum then for being too examination-oriented, for being too, bookish, for being too knowledge-based, so to say. And employers particularly were complaining that graduates from both the school system and also the university system were not able to participate in various contexts which require them to think critically, which require them to solve problems. This is what then informed the competence-based curriculum when it was generated. Of course, after that commission of inquiry, there was also a research whereby the curriculum development unit was tasked to look around the world on how they were doing things, especially in the 21st century. And that's what brought about the competence-based curriculum.
It reminds me as well, Melis will know that within the university we have an educational development unit which does some, so for new academics and things without teaching qualifications, there's an opportunity to do a certificate, postgraduate certificate of academic practice. And one of those modules I also teach on because I have a good hand. And there we work with some colleagues who are in Ghana as well as our colleagues in China and in Zimbabwe who are teaching in our international teaching partnerships. And currently I've got a few colleagues who are in Ghana. I think they were talking about law, but I will go back and check because they were raising very much the same sorts of issues from the perspective of the employers in terms of the graduate, the way in which the degrees were supporting the students, and that they weren't coming out and the students were arriving wanting, as your trainee teachers are wanting, to be told the knowledge, but actually they're trying to move them to what is, I suppose, a higher education experience, which is about critical thinking and some of those elements. So it's interesting to see the connections there as well.
Any other questions? Okay, fine. If you have one? Okay. Okay, I have one. So that's related to, our reason for that we're working on, for the past 1 year, we're working on conflict issues with you, and we're now, starting off this peace education project. So, and then all the issues that you mentioned, of historical literacy, consciousness and awareness are actually, a global issues, a universal, I would say, a values that everyone wants to embed into their, historic curriculum or historic teaching or, a teacher training programs. But I just was wondering, you were talking about these issues, but how do you really engage with this? Because when you're talking about, because peace education is very much related to history, and then we know that when you think about the conflict that Zimbabwe has been through, and I know that there were some things that you are supposed to not teach, what I mean, or supposed to teach from a censored perspective. Or there's some things that you cannot really voice. So as you teach them, so how does historical then literacy and awareness play into that? The governments that's anywhere in the world, embed their ideologies into how we teach history, and sometimes this doesn't reflect the truth. So how can you just ask your students to develop historical literacy and awareness when, they're not getting the, as you were saying, the truth? So, is it possible?
I don't want to rule out, the idea of possibilities, even in very difficult circumstances. Even in contexts where there is a limited democratic space.
Yeah.
I know that our own so-called liberation icons underwent a system of education which was segregatory. But it is the same system which was not meant to produce critical citizens, which produced them who then started fighting against oppression. So circumstances do not limit our potential to do that which we can do in order to do what we want to do. So what am I saying? Even in the context of Zimbabwe, where certain narratives are regarded as a taboo, it is possible for a teacher to push himself or the learners out of their comfort zone, where they are satisfied with just historical literacy or just awareness, and stress them to go beyond those two and come to the level of historical consciousness. if once they start asking questions like, but how come this is what is happening? I'll give you an example. In the year 2000, when the movement for democratic change was gaining ground in Zimbabwe, which was informed more by urbanites, Democrats. There was a topic which was removed from the history syllabus, O-level, which focused on Russian Revolution. And we said that's exactly the same time we started looking also east. We started emphasizing now on the Chinese Revolution, which was more PSA. To people who are critical, like I expect myself to be, we then say the reason why this was removed is because it was conscientizing people of the potential that urbanites have to lead the revolutions against oppressive systems. So this is despite of the fact that you wouldn't stand up and question the government. Even our learners, some of them right now as I teach the master's program, I ask some of those questions, difficult questions, where they start suggesting, could it be possible that this was done so as to satisfy the political, the wishes of those who are in power? All I'm trying to say is, even in context of restricted democratic space, it is possible to teach for historical consciousness, though it may be difficult. We'll then use our own, critical thinking to make decisions, informed decisions on what to say and how to say it, what to teach and how to teach it. Yeah.
It is possible, but it could be dangerous.
It could be dangerous, that's true.
Yeah. So actually, you are trading off your freedom.
Yeah.
As you work towards that.
That's true.
Any more questions? No questions from online audiences? Okay. So thank you very much for coming. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a video recording of the seminar will be available shortly on the address website. And the room will be available until 2:30 for conversations if required. And the next seminar will again take place in this room, B59, County South, on Wednesday, 6th of November. And it will be presented by Dr. Kathy Earle, and the title is Nurturing Dissent, Developing the Unruly Subject in Higher Education. Thank you so much.
Thank you.